Hi, my name is Sean Devine. I'm the playwright of Daisy. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the play and the production happening at International City Theatre, watch this video. I started in theater quite a long time ago. So I grew up Catholic, and I went to Catholic church, and we had plays like we had our annual Christmas pageant, and I remember like one of my earliest plays like was was playing Joseph in a Christmas pageant, and I kind of started just getting intrigued by that. And then I remember, so I live in Canada, and when I was about 5 years old, my parents took me on a trip to to Santa's workshop in upstate New York, and I was only about 4 or 5, and I remember Santa asking for a volunteer from the audience. And it was I think one of the first times I'd ever put my hand up and say, yeah, I'll be your volunteer. And I went up, and I barely remember what I did. I barely remember what Santa asked me to do, but I remember doing something perhaps naughty or silly and getting getting a laugh from the audience, and being, it was a rather, for me, for a 5-year-old, it was like a rather large audience of 50 people, and being intrigued by all of those people laughing at the same time. So I think a little bug snuck in there. And from that point on, like, to answer your other question about why was there nothing else that I could do, I think from that point on, like a lot of theater kids, you just kind of focus on that, and you don't focus on anything else. And from that point on, that's all I focused on in high school. That's all I focused on in college. And then I went to theater school. My parents would have preferred that I went to university, but I went to theater school, which was where I lived. It was a conservatory. It wasn't like going to university where I get a degree, something that I could do something with. I just went to theater school. And when I was there, that was the first time I encountered the big roadblock of my theater teachers, telling me that I couldn't graduate, let alone be a professional actor, because I had a speech impediment. And I always knew I had a speech impediment, but nobody really put up any roadblocks because of it. They just kind of let me go along, and I figured, okay, this is no big deal. But at theater school, they started telling me that I won't be able to graduate, and I certainly can't expect to have any kind of career. But it just so happened that while I was in theater school taking my actor's training, we had a playwright who came in and taught playwriting to the actors. And I had been doing playwriting as a kid. I fooled around and did playwriting, as a teenager. But I didn't ever take it seriously. But in theater school, this playwright came in and started teaching all the actors, and it was going well. I was finding, hey, I kind of like this playwriting thing. And then basically, my acting teachers and the dean of the school, they basically kicked me out. They said I couldn't come back to third year to graduate. And lo and behold, the playwriting teacher said, okay, if you're going to kick him out of acting training, I'll take him back in as a playwright. So that was kind of the birth of me thinking that, wow, I guess maybe I should, take writing a little bit more seriously. I carried on, and I continued being both an actor and a playwright. But if it hadn't been for that teacher, I think I would have gone off the deep end. I love both acting and playwriting, but I definitely, as I began to do more and more playwriting and perhaps less and less acting, I realized that my passion was more in writing than in acting. And don't get me wrong, like I love acting and I really enjoy it. But what I started to notice when I started doing both, it started to feel as if I had an acting job, my scope of responsibility was limited to that role. I started to feel like that I was being hired to decorate. I often use this this building or designing a house metaphor. But as an actor, I was being hired to work exclusively on painting one room of this house. And don't worry about the other rooms of the house. There's other people taking care of those rooms. You just focus on your room. But then as a playwright, I was given license to paint the whole house and design the whole house. And maybe I'm a bit of a control freak, I don't know. But I started to enjoy, I found that I was able to flex a lot more muscles as a playwright. I was able to play with a whole lot more colors as a playwright. Maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that means that I wasn't as good an actor. But I just started finding that my imaginative world opened up a whole lot more. As a playwright, there was far less boundaries on what I could do. If I was acting in a play, obviously I wanted to follow that playwright's intention and that director's vision, and I couldn't bend the laws of what that play would be if I was an actor. But if I was the playwright, I could invent the laws of what that play might be anytime, every time I started a new play. So over the course of my, like, let's say the last 20 years, I started to just feel a lot more validated as an artist in writing more than acting. I still do both, but I enjoy the writing more. I've only written 4 plays professionally. And 3 of the 4 plays, they all kind of, the concept, because your question is, what's my process for starting from a concept and working on through? It just so happened to be that the concept for 3 of the 4 plays all kind of happened at the same time. I landed upon the ideas for 3 plays pretty much all at once. They're all very thematically linked. Daisy is one of them. But to answer the question about what is my overall process, the plays that I've done, the plays that I'm usually drawn to are quite often based on history. And so I'm also a bit of a research nerd. So for the 3 plays that I did that are based on history, including Daisy, I spent like way too long, a couple of years, just getting to know the history of the event. And my research would take me like far and wide. For Daisy, like I would be in New York or in Washington, D.C., interviewing the real people who were part of the story, visiting the real sites where the story took place, accessing archives at the Smithsonian, doing tons and tons of research. And then I would, try to condense all of that research into a story and into a structure. And then for me, the hardest part has always been writing the first draft. That for me is always the hardest part, just getting through one complete pass of the story. And from that point on, it's a lot easier for me and a lot more fun because I then go into a pretty lengthy process of workshopping. And I would say I probably do about 20 drafts of a play, and it'll change drastically from beginning to end. And what I usually do is I like to work with one person primarily. That person is ideally the person who's going to be directing the play. And typically I like to work with a director who is good at new play development. And then the process I typically like to do is I go through a lengthy process of writing drafts and then having workshops of the play. Ideally, the people in those workshops are the actors or designers who might eventually be in the production, because I kind of get their input and investment into the play. And so that process might take a year or 2 of refining the script. And when I'm in the workshop, what I really do in the workshop is I listen. I use my actor ear and I just kind of listen to the dialogue, and there's always like I have a bit of a spidey sense of when the dialogue isn't working, when it's clunky, when it feels like it's not landing on anything solid, when it feels like the action is stalling. And then I kind of just stop, and I, like, right in the middle of it, I'll just make big sweeping changes and then test it out again. And then, and then I go to opening night and I listen, and I wish I'd made a few more changes. Yeah, I do think it is a little bit easier for me writing the plays because I have an actor background, because for a few reasons. Even when, like, you were talking about Shakespeare earlier, and even when I have Shakespeare experience in my background too, and that has always given me an appreciation for strong, effective language, and language that doesn't meander and waste words. So when I'm in that listening process of my writing, when I'm in a workshop, my ear, or my actor's ear, is listening to stuff that just feels like it's not going to flow off the tongue very well, or it feels clunky. Like, as an actor, I've done good plays and I've done bad plays, and I always know when I'm, if I'm acting in a play that isn't so good, where the writing feels clunky. I try to listen to my actor sense when I'm hearing my own play being read by other actors, and when I can see, and I try to hire really good actors for these workshops, and when I can see them stumbling, and when I can see that they themselves are having a difficult pass of getting through something, I know that it's usually something that I'm doing wrong. And so my trust in those actors and my trust in my own actor's ear, I think it does help. Like I mentioned earlier, that I kind of came up with 3 plays all at the same time, and those plays were thematically linked. They were linked. There's a few common threads to each of those plays. One of them is that they are all set in the American mid-1960s. They're all based on real events. And they're also based on real events that have a contemporary resonance with the time that I discovered those stories in. And I think one thing that I was realizing was that I wasn't writing plays based on history because I wanted them to be history lessons. I was writing plays based on history because I wanted them to be reminders. What I discovered in each of these stories set a generation ago was that they exposed different kinds of failings of what it is to be human. And it was me recognizing that we as a species continue to make the same critical mistakes generation after generation. And I think it sometimes requires seeing that time and time again to hopefully at some point admit that we fail, and hopefully do better. The other thing that I found in all of these plays was each of them was a story. Each of them, to some extent, is a David versus Goliath story. One thing I'm often drawn to is stories where an individual idealist fights a large institution. And in this case, that institution was typically government or some kind of political force. And as this individual idealist fights that institution, they typically also find that their own personal selfish ambition or greed gets in the way of their idealism. Why did I have to write that? Maybe because I was going through a similar kind of journey myself, or I fancied myself an idealist, but I realize that I'm human just like everybody else, and I have failings, and sometimes those failings get in the way of my own idealism. Yeah. Daisy. Daisy is about, it takes place during the 1964 presidential election, where Lyndon Johnson, who had just prior to that been made president when Kennedy was killed, Lyndon Johnson is now fighting to become president of his own right. And Lyndon Johnson knows that he wants to advance a pretty ambitious agenda, something that we all eventually learn to become the Great Society. And Johnson knows that he is likely going to be up against Barry Goldwater, who was a pretty radical candidate from the right wing. And what Johnson wanted to do was Johnson wanted to win by a landslide, so that he could be president in his own right, and come out of the shadow of Kennedy. And so Johnson hired this ad agency out of New York called Doyle Dane Bernbach. And this was at a time when ad agencies were kind of, I guess, getting a little bit boring. And this ad agency, Doyle Dane Bernbach, they were leading something brand new and bold called the Creative Revolution. And he hires this ad agency and gives them a mission to do whatever they can to crush Barry Goldwater. This ad agency starts putting together some ideas and some ads. And they go out and they hire this eccentric sound genius called Tony Schwartz, and all of them create this ad called the Daisy ad. And when they see this ad, they realize that it's probably far too shocking to put on television. If you haven't seen it already, the Daisy ad was basically an anti-nuclear war ad, and the ad was designed to scare the pants out of people. And by putting this ad out on TV, they shocked the nation, and Johnson got his massive landslide. All the while this advertising team is making the ad, they're wrestling with the ethics of it. They're wrestling with whether or not it's ethical to put out such a dangerous negative message on TV. They do it anyways. Johnson wins, and then Johnson goes on and escalates the war in Vietnam. And what you see there was a group of idealists who thought that they were putting out a message to advance peace, and they found out that the message they put out put in power a man who escalated war. I think one thing, so here we are, we're I'm Canadian, but I certainly watch what's going on in the States, and we're about to watch the second election in a row in which we're learning that there are forces at play in the way that elections are waged, where voters are manipulated in ever more dangerous ways. For the last 4 years, we heard about how fake news grew to become a phenomenon where it's hard for people to even know what is true anymore. And that power to manipulate people is used during elections when ideally, and there again, I use the word idealism there, but ideally, an election should be seen as a pretty important, if not sacred time, when every citizen is handed clear, unvarnished, factual information in which they can make a decision that represents what they honestly, truly want, so that we can have a verdict that represents the will of the people. And that process gets aborted and tarnished and twisted around to the point where voters hardly can even know what they're really choosing when they do vote. They're just being pushed and pressured and manipulated into making choices. That certainly is one of the things that Daisy talks about, because that campaign, the 1964 campaign, was the time that manipulation of voters' intentions came to bear in a way that it never did. And at the heart of the play, the play ends with a question about whether or not people are truly good inside, and if they are, will a good result come out of that? So I think that's what people walk away from the play looking at, that they have to really be responsible for being as informed as they can when they do vote, and to never forget that powerful forces are doing whatever they can to manipulate them into making choices. This has been an interesting year for me for Daisy. Daisy was supposed to have 4 different productions this year, and COVID certainly got in the way of all of them. Here in Ottawa, I was co-producing a production of Daisy that opened and closed on the same night. It opened on March 12th and closed on March 12th. And that was something that I put a lot of years of care into, and so that was bittersweet. For the Los Angeles production, well, sorry, I'll talk about the Los Angeles production in a second. There's a production in Cincinnati that I was really excited about. That also got canceled. And what that company did is they rehearsed it, but they filmed it. So they turned what was going to be a stage production into a filmed production. And I haven't seen that, but that's going to be very interesting to see. For ICT, for International City Theatre, it's definitely bittersweet for me because I've never been to Los Angeles, and I was planning on going down there to see it. So obviously I couldn't do that. But I know who is in it, and it's a bunch of fantastic actors. So I'm excited to see what they're going to be doing. And I've never seen a virtual production of my play. And I know that they're going to be fusing in a lot of the audio archive material that goes with the play. So what I'm most intrigued by, because I haven't seen what they're going to do, but I've been told what they're going to do. What I'm most intrigued by is, from the way I've told they're going to do it, I'm going to see 6 different screens for the 6 different characters. And I imagine it's going to feel a lot more intimate than if it were on a big stage where the actors are spread out 20 feet apart or whatever. I've got my fingers crossed. I think any playwright is nervous on opening night, whether that opening night is in person or online. I'm excited to see it, but I've got my fingers crossed. I'll be very grateful if they watch this version of Daisy, but even more important for me to tell your viewers that they must see this production of Daisy. I'm more inclined to tell your viewers that they must see theater in general. I've been a lover of theater for all of my life. Being inside a theater building, being among theater people, is usually a time when I feel that I'm closest to the best of what humanity is and can be. And I was watching something the other day, and theater brings out, I think, that theater brings out our humanity. Theater brings out our sense of community with each other. I was talking to the artistic director of ICT, and I was talking about how there's a phenomenon that when you go see a play in a building with other people, and you're in a room with a couple hundred other people watching a play, at some point, all of your breathing starts to happen at the same time. You start to breathe at a certain pace with each other. And that's an experience that can't be had in another way. Whether or not that can translate to a virtual theater, I don't know. But at some extent, it is still a bunch of people sitting around a bright light, watching a story being told. And I still do think, whether it's virtual or in person, that still does bring out the best of humanity. And I think now, as we're going through some pretty dark and stressful times, it's a really good time for us to be in touch with the best of our humanity. I think so. There's a big movement going on now, and I'm sure it's the same in Los Angeles as it is where I live in Ottawa. But because of COVID, there's a big movement of buy local, shop local. Try to support that small business that runs in your hometown. Now, obviously, a theater like ICT in Long Beach is a different kind of business than your mom and pop fruit and vegetable store. But any theater in any city is a hub for community building, and I would say that applies to ICT just as much as it applies to anyone. So it would be like, there are going to be businesses there's going to be industries that fall apart due to COVID, but it would be a damn shame to lose theater companies. Like, I remember this comment. There's a quote from Winston Churchill when, during World War II, Winston Churchill was being pressured to slash his national budget at every department, and he was being advised by his aides to slash the funding to arts and culture. To which he, and I can't remember the exact quote, but to which his answer was, "No, how dare we? That's what we're fighting for." And there are a lot of people who, to some extent, think that arts and culture is a peripheral need. But going back to what I said earlier, that's where we find our humanity. That's where we come together and breathe together and be together. So any opportunity to fight to save those kinds of organizations like ICT is something that it's a fantastic investment. When somebody buys a theater ticket at a time like this, you're doing a lot of good for a lot of people. Hi, so I'm the playwright of Daisy, taking place at International City Theatre right now. If you enjoy this conversation, and if you enjoy conversations that happen here at Stage Explorations, please feel free to support International Theatre by buying a ticket to go see my play, happening October 24th to November 7th.